So what I would like to do for the rest of this session is to look at some historical approaches, in fact, three historical approaches, structuralism, behaviorism, and the cognitive approach, in order to understand how it is that people have tried to study the human mind. And the reason for doing this is because by understanding what people have done in the past, the upsides, the downsides, and the struggles of the field, um, the successes and limitations, we can understand and appreciate how we are trying to approach the study of the human mind today. So the first approach, as I was saying, is that of structuralism. Now, structuralism is a school of psychology that emerged in the late 1870s. And it emerged at a time when a lot of progress was being made in other fields, for example, physics and chemistry. And this progress had been achieved by breaking down complex processes into simpler component parts. So structuralism really attempted to do the same thing in order to study the human mind. So structuralism really attempted to study the human mind, defining the human mind as the collection of all of the experiences that somebody has had from birth to the present. And the idea was to analyze the human mind by deconstructing it into its elementary components, whatever might be the simplest, the definable components of the human, of the contents of the human mind. So maybe this could be, let's say, in the visual domain, something like just a color, a shape, a size relation. And the idea was to decompose the human mind into elementary components, to then try to understand how these elementary components would fit together and give rise to the contents of your consciousness, to give rise to the contents of somebody's mind. But the question, of course, is how can you achieve such a result? And see, the founding hypothesis of structuralism is that the workings of one's own mind are open to self-observation. So this is sort of a strong hypothesis at the basis of structuralism. And see, if this is possible, then you can accept that that very intense self-inspection of one's own mind by trained practitioners, who would be trained to very carefully consider and describe their own internal experiences in terms of these very basic elements of consciousness, then this approach could be seen as a promising path towards discovering what these basic principles might be and how these basic elements would combine together to form your experience. So the idea of somebody looking inwards and very carefully self-inspecting the contents of one's thoughts is known as the method of introspection. Just to be clear, the school in of itself is known as structuralism because of this approach that I just mentioned, but the method that it uses to study the human mind is the method of introspection. Now, Wilhelm Wundt, who founded the school of structuralism, is rightfully credited with founding the first scientific psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig. Structuralism itself, however, did not outlast the single generation of students directly trained by Wundt. Now, the failure of structuralism, the demise of structuralism, ultimately, is generally attributed to a deep failure of the method of introspection. And there are at least three reasons why this methodology was not a methodology suitable for understanding the human mind. Now, first, of course, there happened to be very poor agreement across introspectors. And see, obviously, if you think of it, the nature of self-introspection is very private. I have access to my own thoughts, you have access to your own thoughts, but neither of us has access to the thoughts of the other person. So in this sense, there was no way to ever objectively verify somebody's reports. In this sense, somebody could pretty much report um, their subjective experience, but nobody could verify this. And it's very hard to develop a scientific theory of the human mind without being able to have other people verify a certain observation. And this is tied to the very important notion of replication. The idea that you need to have different researchers perform the exact same experiment using the exact same methodology, so that if you do get the same result, the same verifiable result, then this really strengthens the case for the veracity of that observation. And typically, modern theories are based on this kind of approach, on verifiable, replicatable observations. Now, with introspection, of course, there's just a complete lack of objectivity, and this prevents any confirmation of any single introspector's reports. Now, the second big issue with introspection is that many, or I would say most, mental operations take place completely outside of the domain of your awareness. What I mean by that is that they're just not accessible to conscious introspection. Most of what you do is just not accessible to conscious introspection. Think of what you're doing right now. Look at the words on the screen. Do you have any access to the processes inside your mind that allow you to recognize these dots on a screen as forming a special kind of organization that happens to be letters of a specific language that happen to cluster together in groups that happen to have certain meanings, that happen to be put together and strung together in a certain way that give rise to a certain meaning that I am trying to convey to you. You have zero access to any of this. And that's the beauty of the human mind. It just happens for you. Your mind is built so that these processes can happen to you without you having to effortfully carry them out. So for the most part, most of what's going on inside your mind just falls outside the domain of your awareness. Therefore, you can't access it and you can't introspect it. So even if introspection didn't have the first problem, probably it would be a small minority of the human mind that we could access. And certainly not that basic part of the human mind that one would like to access. Finally, it is worth considering the fact that even if this were doable, the process of observing the contents of one's own mind in of itself is likely to be changing the nature of the processes that you're observing. Think of it this way. Imagine you came to my lab and I asked you to solve a complex problem, but I also asked you to please talk me through what you're thinking as you're solving it. I think it's undoubtable that the act of you trying to report on what you're thinking and on what you're doing, which interrupts your thinking, is certainly changing the nature of how you're solving the problem, compared to me letting you do your thing without ever asking you to do anything. And so, in this sense, even if it were possible to introspect into your own mind, that in of itself would probably change the nature of what you are observing. So ultimately, structuralism was destined for failure.